General Robert E. Lee, the largest, last, and perhaps most divisive Confederate monument
erected to say that the white man will be supreme,
removed from the Confederacy's former capital, Richmond. And the end of an arc that began a year earlier with global protests triggered by George Floyd's murder and expanded to the removal of statues considered totems of oppression.
We're moving closer to equality.
If they want to see, this should be in the museum.
But that requires engaging with a painful and disputed history over what the Confederacy stood and fought for, as well as the period defined by racial segregation when many of these monuments were built.
The heart of the Confederacy still beats strong in this charmed city of the South.
Nobody was really willing to have the monument discussion even in 2015. They were like, well, no, those are staying.
Please expand out.
Historian and Richmond native LEXI Cleveland is leading those discussions with the benefit of augmented reality to open up all perspectives on a period that continues to divide Americans along mostly the same geographic lines as the Civil War itself.
We didn't talk about it. You guys didn't talk about it?
We never really learned about it.
Tours like these are a glimpse into how Richmond, whose biggest draw was once Monument Avenue, is coming to terms with its past.
The North was not graceful about their victory.
What strikes me immediately about this kind of tour is how every aspect of slavery and the Civil War is now up for renewed scrutiny. For example, as much as the southern states were blamed for going to war to defend slavery, the predominantly northern states who supported its abolition are now being blamed for sowing the seeds of what we today call the culture wars, driving an ever-widening gulf between Democrats and Republicans.
Whose history, though?
But how these spaces are used in the future is fraught for the city's branch of Black Lives Matter.
The only pedestal of any significance is the one that's already been repurposed, right? But let me tell you, all of the rest of the pedestals have already been repurposed as well. But guess what? They allowed the power washers. Police sat there, watched the power washed them to where they no longer held any type of context of what has happened over the last year. So they erased our history.
The sons of Confederate veterans are thinking along similar lines, but for different reasons.
The Lee Monument itself is one of the most majestic monuments to any subject in North America, arguably. And so any contextualization dictated by the government will be an inaccurate rendering. In a supposedly free society, again, the individual should be allowed to form their own opinion.
But that argument doesn't have much traction in Germany.
There are no Nazi monuments in Berlin. And I don't know a city in the world that's more conscious of its history.
Susan Neiman's book, Learning from the Germans, compares how they came to terms with the horrors unleashed by the Nazis with the ongoing US debate over slavery's legacy.
And now they were free.
While Auschwitz, the Nazi extermination camp in Poland, opened to visitors 2 years after the Second World War ended, Germany only latterly began to come to terms with the Third Reich's victims.
There were an awful lot of Adolf Hitler's streets and squares named for Hitler. There were a lot of swastikas put on buildings, and all of those had to go. That was decided by the Allies. But there was no decision about what should happen afterwards. And it wasn't really until the 80s that a grassroots movement in Berlin pushed people to think about, how do we remember the victims? How do we remember the war?
And language may be critical for how the US comes to terms with its own heritage.
Jim Crow itself is a problem. I want to campaign to abolish the expression. Jim Crow suggests, okay, there was prejudice, there were racist caricatures, we know there was segregation, but but it's too bad. It wasn't all that bad. If you use the words, the age of racial terror, you have a very different picture than when you use the words Jim Crow.
One US activist coming to terms with how some monuments are contextualized is Glenn Foster.
We're done sitting around. We're done being nice.
During the 2020 protests, he led an aborted attempt to topple this statue of Abraham Lincoln, the president who abolished slavery, driven by objections to the liberated slaves' supplicatory posture. But freed slaves helped pay for it and made Glenn think again.
It's important to understand that when you're taking down monuments, you're not taking down out of anger or emotion, because I think cancel culture is always canceling things because of the negative history or the context of that history. And really what cancel culture is adjusting accountability through the modern sense. And so ensuring that these monuments are up here because they represent a certain symbolism, they represent a certain history, an emotional history. And I think it's separating those two, making sure that it's not subjective, but rather objective how it came to be, is very important.
Lexi Cleveland thinks last year's protests were too historic for the public to live with even contextualized Confederate monuments.
All of that kind of went out the door last summer when everybody was just like, well, no, this is unacceptable, context or no context.
But her tours are resonating.
One of the comments I usually kind of get is, oh, well, you know, I was taught in school, you know, like kind of one version of history, and I never realized, you know, how my like regional upbringing actually affected, you know, the facts I was learning.
An opportunity for the next generation to reevaluate their own perspective on divisive history. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Richmond, Virginia.